Hi, and welcome back to It's Not History, the podcast where the past is never dead. It's not even past. This is episode 3, Way Back. So, if you had asked me before I started doing this episode, when did people start to live here in the homeland of the Conestoga Susquehannock, the Susquehanna River Valley in central Pennsylvania, dragging my perspective along with me, as I pointed out in the last episode, I would have said probably, viewing it through my Anglo lens of experience and knowing the answer is some flavor of a very, very long time ago, I'd probably latch on to something I think that's really old, say Stonehenge in England. And given that I vaguely remember that Stonehenge is about 5,000 years old, I'd throw another millennium on top and probably said with modest confidence, okay, about 6,000 years ago is when, Susquehanna, Conestoga, or their forebears showed up here. So I was wrong, completely wrong, and by a lot, off by 14,000 years. This is Debbie Saylor. She's the curator of Indian Steps Museum and the Blue Rock Heritage Center in Lancaster County. Also president of the Chapter 28 of the Society of Pennsylvania Archaeology. So, in fact, people, us, modern humans, were here about 16,000 years ago. And it might even be longer, but we know for a fact that people have been here in what's now Pennsylvania for at least the last 16,000 years, which is, in fact, as long, if not longer, than almost any place else we know of on this continent.
We do not know their names. We don't know if they were really even tribes. These were bands of small nomadic people that were hunting mastodons in the area. And that is a timeline called the Paleo-Indian. That's between 16,000 to 8,000 BC. So that grouping, we don't know who they were, but we do have evidence of their hunting tools, their spears called Clovis points.
We know about this because they built a settlement under the shelter of overhanging rocks in western Pennsylvania at a place called the Meadowcroft site. This site was occupied for at least 2 and maybe as much as 3,000 years. And to put this in perspective, and again using my Anglo lens of perception, when the Meadowcroft site was being built, Stonehenge would not be built in England for another 10,000 years. The inhabitants in the Meadowcroft site lived in a world that was completely alien to the one we live in today.
And the climate was very different then. They were hunting big game animals. They were not settling down. They were constantly on the move. They were nomadic. So that is the type of people that were roaming through Pennsylvania during that time period.
Pretty much everyone in the Northern Hemisphere at the time were in the same boat. This was shortly after the last ice age, and retreating glaciers had completely altered the landscape. It looked nothing like the world today. They didn't have writing at the time to tell us about the world themselves. Nobody did. But we know about them from their tools.
So that grouping, we don't know who they were, but we do have evidence of their hunting tools, their spears called Clovis points. You're finding stone artifacts. You're not finding any pieces of wood, how those things were hafted. You're not finding any kind of shafts on that went on the spears. You're not finding any kind of fiber. You're not finding any kind of leather, like clothing that they would wear, or maybe their shoes, like moccasins, things like that, boots that they would make out of animal skins. You're not finding any of that, especially in Pennsylvania, because our soils are very acidic and those things deteriorate very quickly.
In what would become central Pennsylvania later, people here, like pretty much people everywhere at the time, roamed a space that was geographically very similar. The mile-high ice sheets were done with terraforming, but the climate and environment, as Ken Carr, the author of The First Pennsylvanians, describes it, was a world, quote, unlike anything that exists today. It was a world with no parallels to any ecologies currently found. Forests were far in the future. This was more like a mountainous tundra with megafauna, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and, strangely, camels.
So then this was some conditions were permafrost, some weren't. The climate was still covered with ice. It was cold, and then it had areas where it was more tundra, more grasslands. So the climate there was able to support this tundra-like environment, and that's why the people were able to spear and hunt these big game, because that environment supported the big game animals.
This was a very difficult neighborhood. The megafauna would be gone in a few millennia for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Maybe climate change, maybe overhunting, probably both. But still, a tough neighborhood. The people, however, remained. How many?
As far as these small bands, these small nomadic bands, in this hunting stage, nomadic stage, you're only talking about maybe 25, 35 people. Because if you had more than, say, 50 or 100, you're talking about settlement pattern.
So, not many. And this goes on for thousands of years. And the climate continues to change, and the people continue to adapt.
So, and this was, some conditions were permafrost, some weren't. The climate was still covered with ice. It was cold, and then it had areas where it was more tundra, more grasslands. So the climate there was able to support this tundra-like environment, and that's why the people were able to spear and hunt these big game, because that environment supported the big game animals.
And so the megafauna goes, but trees and forests come in. At first, spruce and fir, northern tundra species, and later hardwoods, chestnut and oak. And these first people, these first Pennsylvanians, continue to adapt to a slowly changing world.
But then if you take a look at what they call the transitional period, that's between 2000 BC and 1000. The climate changed. Now you're starting to get pine forests, you're starting to get hardwoods. So that changes the whole environment. So now they went from hunting, now they're going to go into using more trees. They're going to be eating more berries. More plant-like material is now forming in the environment. You're getting pine forests are coming up. Then you're going to go into where the hardwoods come. Now you're getting bushes. So then you have, especially with the hardwoods, you have acorns, all these different trees, pawpaw, which is a native to Pennsylvania. Then you have all these different blueberries, raspberries. You opened up the whole field, basically, a whole field of different herbs that people could start living on. And they started using plant material to start making woven mats and baskets. They started making lightweight carrying items. So everything's starting to change. You're going from that paleo, now you're going through the early, middle, and late archaic. Then you went to the transitional period, and that's why they call it the transitional period, because that was the biggest change in the way people lived.
So this was when the people started to create a distinct culture and enjoy the many gifts the Susquehanna River had to offer. So what I'd like to do is take a moment to locate this discussion in the geography of the place we're talking about. It'll become important later in this story. So Pennsylvania is composed of 3 major river systems and 1 major mountain system. To the east is the Delaware River. It forms the state's eastern boundary and separates Pennsylvania from what's now the state of New Jersey. It flows into the Delaware Bay, which then empties into the Atlantic Ocean. The city of Philadelphia sits on the southern end of the Delaware River. In the west, the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers meet in the present-day city of Pittsburgh to form the Ohio River. It then drains into the Mississippi and eventually the Gulf of Mexico. Bisecting the middle of the state is the Susquehanna. It starts in the central part of the state and then runs south past Lancaster, where it meets the Chesapeake Bay. It's the longest river in the eastern United States. Separating the Ohio River Basin and the Susquehanna River Basin is the northern extent of the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Alleghenies. All of this geography is old. California was still a gleam in the continent's eye and not yet born when all of these features were well into adulthood. The Allegheny Mountains were formed when what would become the continent of Africa was still attached to New Jersey before it was carried away on tectonic plates a few 100 million years ago. These mountains, the Alleghenies, are geological pencil stubs, barely topping out at 3,000 feet. But they are in fact a remnant of mountains that once rivaled the Himalayas, worn down over 300 million years. And weirdly, the Susquehanna River is even older than the mountains it flows through. That's because the Susquehanna River is one of the oldest rivers in the world. At 350 million years old, only a small handful have been around longer. The Ohio River in the west, by comparison, was formed 1.5 million years ago, an infant. So while the Susquehanna itself has been immutable, the people living in and around it proved adaptable.
And if you notice,
So after 12,000 years of a very nomadic lifestyle, things change. The climate gets wet and warm, and the landscape starts to look like it does today. The climate warms, and people take advantage of the abundance and diversity of the plants and animals. So small mobile groups are replaced by larger, more settled ones, some very large.
during this transition, early woodland, we still do not know the name of these people. They were just starting to come from bands or clans. We didn't really get into tribes until in Pennsylvania we know about the Shanks Ferry people.
The human remains in the North Museum we discussed in the last episode, by the way, probably were from a Shanks Ferry person. So everything is going great for the Shanks Ferry people for a very long time, until it's not. Enter the people from the north, the Susquehannock.
Then you had people from the north, they spoke Iroquoian, and Susquehannocks were Iroquoian-speaking people. And they started migrating down the Susquehanna. They started coming down here, but there was already people there, and it was the Shanks Ferry people. So what happened? Well, the Susquehannocks were very warlike people. The males they killed off, or they used them actually like slaves for a conquering tribe. They very rarely killed women and children. They assimilated them into their tribe. And then these migrants from the north settled and made a home in the south, along the river that still bears their name. Homes like no one had ever made before. Then the Susquehannocks, they really developed a wonderful village. Actually, it was almost like a small town. They had between like around 5,000 people, and they had a palisaded fence made out of saplings. And then the Susquehannocks were noted for their living arrangements, and they were called the Susquehannock longhouses. And maybe up to 40, 50 family members lived in that one house. And so picture about 20 of these longhouses, 30 in a palisaded village. You're talking now between 3,000 and 5,000 people, as opposed to these small little bands. A lot of these big longhouses were between 60 and 80 feet long. So they had a very complex social structure. They had a very complex division of labor, and also for foodstuffs. Now is where the food, they started becoming farmers. They started growing corn, beans, squash. Viewers might know it as the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash.
So as most of my listeners probably will know, and this is a really big deal, that for most of the time that Pennsylvania was inhabited, there really were no domesticatable plants on the North American continent, other than a few grasses and herbs. But then maize, or corn, from Mesoamerica spread across the continent and eventually reached the Susquehannock.
So now they're able to sustain themselves even more because they became farmers.
Good farmers, in fact. Really good farmers.
And why they were so successful, especially in Lancaster. Lancaster has a wonderful, fertile soil because of the Susquehanna River flooding and so forth, brought all that nice sediment, brought all those nice minerals with it. They're famous for their tomatoes, Washington Borough tomatoes. They've got beautiful, beautiful soil over there. And the Native Americans found out that they were beautiful soils. So they would actually plant and harvest domesticate certain plants, and then they had their natural environment, which would be berries, fruits, things like that, fish, birds. So they had an abundant food supplies that when they managed correctly, which they did, their bones show that they were not malnourished, that they were a very nice, complex, healthy population. When they did not become a healthy population, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, is when they became in contact with the Europeans.
So among the many gifts that this environment afforded the Susquehannock, those gifts did not include domesticatable animals. And this was true across the North American continent and for all Native American people. Except for dogs, turkeys, maybe ducks, there were few domesticatable animals, and importantly, no pack animals or beasts of burden. Eurasia had horses, oxen, cows, pigs, but until the arrival of Europeans, North America had none of these. So on one hand, this is no more than a cruel accident of geography and zoology. This was on another a critical issue that deprived North Americans of an easy way to transport or move large, heavy things or large quantities of things over any distance. While it's impossible to know what advantage this really might have given the original inhabitants of this continent, had the extinction of most of the megafauna on the continent after the Paleo-Indian period just left Native Americans with a couple of large domesticatable animals, given what was going to happen shortly. In Eurasia, not only did animals help with moving large things long distances, there also were most lethal Eurasian diseases come from, what Jared Diamond once called the lethal gift of livestock. Living in close proximity with animals gave Europeans many of these diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza are all zoonotic. They all are diseases that started in cows or chickens, and at some point jumped ship from animal to human host. And while these diseases afflicted Europeans over centuries, it also conferred on them some immunity and resistance, so that these Europeans could carry pathogens of diseases without necessarily having it kill them. Not having livestock deprived indigenous Americans of not just the leverage that meat and muscle provided, but also, critically, the leverage that a strengthened immune system would have given them. But for now, things are looking great for the people of the Susquehanna Valley. Abundant food as a result of a finely cooperating climate now allows for large-scale settlements, which enables art and what we would call technology. As Jared Diamond once put it, nomadic hunter-gatherers are limited to technology that can be carried. If you move often enough and lacked draft animals, you confine your possessions to babies, weapons, and a bare minimum of other necessities small enough to carry. You can't, as he put it, be burdened with pottery and printing presses. But now, in settled villages and longhouses with surplus food, artisans started to appear in the Susquehanna communities.
So they had an abundant food supplies that when they managed correctly, which they did, their bones show that they were not malnourished, that they were a very nice, complex, healthy population. The Susquehannocks were very artistic people. The women, they made beautiful pottery. In fact, Captain John Smith said in his diary, he said the women potters of the Susquehannocks were better potters than the men in England. And if you look at some of their pottery, I suggest you go to museums or come to Indian Steps or Blue Rock, where I am, we have the real thing. We have the pottery that's full pots, and we could show you how beautiful and intricate and designs that were in this pottery. They're absolutely gorgeous. Then they made beautiful pipes. So they were very artistic at that point, because when you settle down, you have time to add in art or culture. You're able to think about things more, as opposed to constantly worrying about what you're going to eat next. Okay, so the mindset was different. They had time to think. They had time to express themselves.
And they have a sustainable, equitable social structure.
They were, division of labor was there. They had certain social structures. And what fascinated me when I did a lot of research on this, especially when I had to present my thesis, women were very well respected in the tribe. The women were actually the ones who would vote or make sure that the chief would properly guide the people, especially in longhouses. Each longhouse had what they call a clan mother. She made sure she was the one who did the division of the food stuff. So let's give you a picture. You're in this longhouse. You have a clan mother. Then when a warrior or male of the tribe would go and get an elk or deer or whatever, they would cut it up, but it was the clan mother that divided up the foods. So she made sure certain people got the choice foodstuffs for the tribe. And that was very important because she was the one in control. Then they also had, within the longhouse, they had storage pots or pits. And that was where the women gathered the seed, and they had to store them in these big clay vessels that were sealed with like a mud cap so that it didn't become fermented and mold, because that was their survival for the next year when they planted.
So, a great place to live, to settle, to create a culture, to build a society.
In the 1600s, especially say 1600 to 1625, the Susquehannocks were at their zenith of creative arts, everything.
Until it isn't.
When they did not become a healthy population, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, is when they became in contact with the Europeans. And then when they came in contact with the Europeans, like a lot of other places across North America, they didn't have natural immunity, and the white man brought a lot of disease, smallpox in particular.
The archaeological record in this part of the world is 16,000 years or more. 16,000 years of human adaptation, growth, and expansion. Tools and towns, pottery and art. And then in the blink of an eye it hits a wall, and we reach what's known in archaeology simply as the contact period. Of all the parts of the archaeological record in Pennsylvania, it's the shortest, and for indigenous culture, the last. The contact period.
So once they started trading with the Europeans, and there where we're putting it, 1550 contact period, once they started trading, they lost their culture. They lost their tribal unity. They lost their spirituality. Because why? Now the Jesuits are moving in. They want to convert them. They want to convert them to Christianity. And that's why when we excavate on these sites, which I've done that for the last 20 years, we find Jesuit trade rings. We find all these beads from Italy and England. We find all these copper pots, brass pot. We find iron axes, iron hoes, and these are being replaced from their stone tools, their natural pottery, things like that.
The contact period is the last 200 years for which a distinct record of a distinct indigenous culture exists, from about 1550 to about 1750. Barely 1% of the total 16,000-year historical record. Plot a timeline of human habitation in the Americas on the length of a yardstick, and the part of it the Europeans have been here is the last half inch.
It was such sudden change. I mean, let's take just the paleo. Look how long, almost 8,000 years for paleo. Then you had the transitional period, 2000 to 1000 BC. They started coming down to the streams, fishing. They started settling a little bit. Then you went from woodland period to contact period. That was 1000 BC to contact period 15 AD now. Okay, so you have 1 or 2,000 year span there. Look how much just in that 2,000 year span they came from such a almost a stone tool technology to contact period. So between smallpox, the fighting for trade, and they started losing their culture, basically. They started losing control, because at that point, they're no longer, the Susquehannocks are no longer making all their beautiful pottery. They're no longer making their clothing. They're now doing trade goods. So everything changed. Their Susquehanna culture was already on the decline at that point.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So next time we meet the men who, in the words of Neil Young, come dancing across the water with galleons and guns, the first Europeans. They came for the gold and glory and stayed for the disease and starvation. Next time on It's Not History. Thanks very much to my guest, Debbie Saylor. This week's music is by Camille Sanson and Sayuki Takahashi. Theme music is by Evgeny Sorokin. You can find show notes, photos, and more at itsnothistory.com. Please remember to subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments section. And take a moment to share it with someone you like. They will thank you for it. Thanks for listening.